Another 1 minute for people to log on and then we start. Okay, so now it's 1 minute past 12. I would like to welcome you to our new Team Society webinar today about policy mixes for just sustainable development in industrially over-specialized regions. Our speaker today is Asbjørn Karlsen from the Department of Geography, and he will present work he was doing together with Samson Afewerkir from the same department. Just short again about what Team Society is. Team Society is one of several teams under NTNU Energy dealing with energy research, and Team Society specializes on social science and humanities research. And the aim is to be a kind of platform to strengthen the research and showcase it to a broader group of audience. Some practical things: we will record this webinar, so please be aware of that. And if you want to ask questions, you can use the chat or just raise your hand after the presentation. We also have a discussant for this presentation, which is Espen Moe from the Department of Sociology and Political Science, who will start the discussions with some comments, and then we will have a general discussions afterwards. Yeah, so now I would like to give the word to Asbjørn Karlsen to start his presentation.
Thank you, Sara. Thank you very much for inviting me to present on this Team Society webinar. This is a nice chance and timing to have some feedback at this work in progress at a quite early stage by Samson Afewerkir and me, both at the Department of Geography and NTNU. We are invited to contribute to a special issue of the journal European Planning Studies on the topic Regional Innovation Policies in the Era of Grand Societal Challenges. First, some words about the background of our interest in this field. We have been doing research on the offshore wind industry for some years now. In the context of the Norwegian oil and gas economy, we take a two-sector perspective in analyzing the relation between offshore oil and gas and offshore wind. Sectors we recognize as very interrelated. On the one hand, oil supplier and service providers appear relevant also for supplying and for jobs in offshore wind sectors by reusing existing capabilities, competencies, infrastructure, technology, and networks. On the other hand, the two sectors compete for attention, resources, and state support. We recognize an inverse correlation with regard to the respective business cycles, as offshore wind has lost momentum in periods when oil and gas boomed, which created unfavorable discontinuity in developing offshore wind. Over time, a large variety of approaches to sustainable transition are developed. I will not go into detail here, but concentrate on some main points. It is a contested issue between proponents and opponents that are stakeholders that resist a green shift. It's comprehensive, demanding, and long-term, exposed to uncertainty, resistance, and barriers. There's a growing emphasis on the acceleration of sustainable transition due to the increasing urgency to meet international decarbonization targets. Technology changes are faced with market, system, and institutional failures. Achieving rapid transition is therefore dependent on the multifaceted policy intervention. That means policy mixes for us. The policy mix concept has marked innovation policy debate for 2 decades and is particularly relevant in the field of sustainable transition. It's about composing of policies and interaction between its components. In the context of sustainability transition, ideally it embraces both destabilizing the old incumbent regime and the creation of a new regime and overcome the resistance from those affected stakeholders such as fossil fuels extracting industries, its suppliers, or energy-intensive industries. It's dependent on the legitimacy of the policies among key stakeholders, organization with institutional authority. Policy mix concepts alone is somewhat instrumental, if not put into a broader political and institutional conceptualization. There has been a growing engagement on policy focused on just transition. The concept has its origin in the 1970s as labor unions in the US sought support for workers in threatened polluting industries. It is recognized as an international norm by the ILO and included in the Paris Agreement in 2015 and the European Green Deal in 2019. There are some different but interrelated approaches to just transition. Shared solution is about dialogue, mutual understanding, and shared solutions and resilience to environmental change. Social ecological is about change in balance of power, democratic planning and control, and public ownership. Differentiated responsibility is about defending the losers of the transition in sectors facing reduced activity or closures. It could include reskilling of new jobs, wage subsidies, and social protection. The state and capital are responsible here to help out workers. So it's about an active state intervention, and unions are key stakeholders. Differentiated responsibility approach is a pragmatic and the most relevant and feasible approach in the social democracy context of Norway. In our analysis, we focus on 2 dimensions of just sustainable transition policy mixes. The substantive dimension is about nature, scope, and magnitude of transitional assistance and support. The procedural dimension is about nature, scope, and magnitude of consultation and participation, which we believe is crucial for its success. We make a sub-classification of just sustainable policy mixes. Reactive is when it's initiated by crisis that often appear as a shock. It's a help in the short run for sectors negatively affected. Proactive, on the other hand, is forward-looking efforts to maximize the long-term benefits. It targets vulnerable regions, and it's about early implementation. We aim at contributing to the transition literature with novel insights in the geography of just sustainable transition and the legitimation of appropriate multi-scalar policy mixes. We ask, how are economic, social, environmental components of sustainable transition balanced in policy mixes implemented over time in regions with different degrees of industrial overspecialization, where the economic component is local externalities and diversification, the social component ensuring profitable jobs and livelihoods, and the environmental component mitigating climate change and meeting the climate targets globally. How could successful, just, sustainable transition take place in industrial overspecialized region, and how could appropriate policy mixes be legitimized? We conduct case studies of regions of and around Stord in Western Norway and Verdal in Mid-Norway and their oil and gas suppliers and maritime industries, which have been targets of policy mixes such as the traditional regional restructuring program, and more recently, innovation policies such as cluster initiatives. The study is longitudinal and focuses on three critical junctures that separate phases of development. Critical juncture is a moment in time, a shock, and responses to the shock that offers windows of opportunity for change in terms of new initiatives. It is supported by empirical triangulation, document studies such as public policy documents, media coverage, journal articles, formal studies by the authors, and we may also conduct some supplementary interviews. There is a Norwegian tradition for state-led and regulated energy sectors, first on hydropower, later on oil and gas. A taxation regime ensures state revenues and a welfare state. An economic dependence on oil and gas prevails both at the national and regional levels, such as vulnerable communities. Restructuring is thus required due to business cycles in oil and gas and price level reductions, and of course the grand challenges of combating climate change. First, I will mention the Norwegian tradition of tripartite collaboration, as you probably know. We argue that it represents an important backdrop. The Nordic social democratic model is a type of a coordinated market economy where the social democratic movement has had political and popular leadership, where there are explicit commitment to policies that promote employment. The state plays a key role in tripartite collaboration. There prevail high trust in this relation and procedures of dialogue, compromises, and conflict resolution, both at macro and micro level, which are interacting. And this renders support for economic stability and a competitive industry. We intend to show the implication at the regional level in two quite similar regions. We make a point that Stord has a maritime history, whereas Verdal an agricultural history. This may also be the reason why Stord is somewhat more diversified than Verdal, particularly when it comes to types of key products, and thus also less vulnerable for business cycles. The regional industrial restructuring program since the 1980s has targeted municipalities and regions such as Stord and Verdal, an instrument for municipalities and regions facing major challenges and significant decline in employment, a vertical policy instrument as it's jointly funded by the state, county, and municipalities, and it lasts for 4 to 6 years. It should create and ensure profitable jobs through diversification, and as such make the regions more robust. We recognize the emphasis on numbers of new jobs in plans and also counting new jobs created in the evaluations. The first critical juncture just before the turn of the millennium was reactive responses to a crisis. Both regions were hit by a drop in oil prices in 1999 and foreseen loss of several hundreds of jobs. I will not go into detail here, but there are some differences in how the restructuring processes was handled. Both regions have turned more industrially diverse and less vulnerable, perhaps Stord more so than Verdal. The cluster initiative program since the 2000s has been targeting specialized or specializing and networked regions. The program is based on collaboration between the Innovation Norway, SIVA, and the Research Council of Norway. The regions qualify for the program through applications and evaluation. It aims at enhancing innovation, value creation, development of capabilities through collaboration. The diversification is somewhat directional as they talk about focus areas. Even if it's not dedicated to green sustainable transition, further concrete programs have that profile. The second critical juncture took place about 2009 and was mostly proactive. The cluster initiatives are both about diversification in green direction. In short, Stord and the neighboring municipalities joined forces and established the NCE Cleantech, and Verdal, in collaboration with knowledge institutions in Trondheim, established Wind Cluster Mid-Norway. Whereas NCE Cleantech managed to move from demonstration and pilot projects into growing maritime cleantech industry, the cluster process at Verdal lost its momentum because of the withdrawal, particularly of the cornerstone Aker from the offshore wind sector, and also of General Electric from Verdal. The industry actors missed state support for domestic market creation. National life after oil narratives are about greening the petromaritime sector since the 2009. Some green cluster initiatives in the maritime sector resonate to this. The initiatives to create a new regime for renewables is mainly through technology push rather than market creation, but without destabilizing the incumbent regime. For example, continued tax incentives for exploring oil and gas, and opening new fields for exploration by awarding 10 licenses up in the Barents Sea in 2016. The critical juncture taking place in spring 2020 was due to the twin crisis of COVID-19 and drop in oil prices, triggering an oil tax package policy response. Unsurprisingly, both Stord and Verdal were hit hard by the crisis. For Verdal, Aker BP, the Aker subsidiary, put on hold its major project, the construction of the Hod platform for the North Sea. At Kværner Verdal, 180 employees were already laid off and risked a complete shutdown in the following year to ensure activity, employment, but also continued development of new competencies needed for green industrial restructuring. A magnitude of tripartite collaborative bodies put forward proposals for temporary change in the petroleum tax system. A response to the twin crisis. As a response to the twin crisis, the government coalition parties, the Labour Party, the Progress Party, the Centre Party, after some negotiation, agreed on the oil tax package. I will not go into detail here, but rather make some wider reflections. The twin crisis created concern among oil and gas suppliers. As a response, a majority of the political parties awarded tax relief package, including a sort of a tax holiday. The oil companies are helped directly, while the supply industry expects new contracts due to the catalyzation of projects the oil companies had put on hold. The taxation regime seems to turn into an incentive for regulating oil and gas activity and balance business cycles. We see some climate mitigation on the measures on the list, but no explicit requirements in this regard. As there are no measures taken to destabilize the incumbent regime, we recognize a reactive policy for what we call a path extension. The oil companies made use of the vulnerability of the petroleum-dependent communities and its oil and gas supply industry in their argument for tax relief. They argue that such conditions are necessary for taking decisions on continued development of the oil fields. They are supported by the Confederation of Norwegian Enterprises, the employers involved, the Norwegian Confederation of Trade Unions, the local union, and the main political parties already mentioned. When the tax relief package was ready, the HOD project could restart. Independently of this, Verdal actors have been preparing for a new production line with new technologies, among others, a new generation of automatic welding for serial production of jackets, their main project. What seems different from previous critical juncture is that there is a general belief among oil and gas actors on the inevitability of life after oil. Hence, the main narrative accompanied by some serious commitments from the industry was that the package could play a crucial role in positioning the companies in the adjacent renewable sectors. As you may see from the image, the expected future markets are jackets for oil and gas, jackets for offshore wind, and huge ocean fish farms. There are further initiatives for restructuring in the region branded as Green Shift. Industrinavet i Trøndelag is a partnership that has its core in Verdal Industry Park. Its collaborating partners are R&D and educational institutions, local and regional authorities, regional industrial agencies, and SINTEF. Industrinavet is strategically exploring the market for market possibilities among other fish farming sectors. Kværner and Aker Company have taken strategic initiatives on renewables, which they consider to be still more relevant. Green Shifts has more substance in the wider Stord region than at Verdal. It have also developed quite independently of the third critical juncture. Maritime Cleantech has had several demonstration projects which has demonstrated battery technology. The development of battery ferries are supported by public procurements. They have also increasingly started to look at hydrogen fuel cell technology with the aim of addressing emissions from cruise ships and other long-distance vessels, and recently in building the world's first hydrogen driven ferry. As we sum up the two cases at critical juncture, we look at local responses and the changes in balances of short-term economic and social issues and green shift momentum. Under the first critical juncture, the Norwegian tradition for collaboration in ensuring jobs and economic restructuring is evident at Stord and Verdal. The second critical juncture can be characterized by somewhat proactive policy mixes aimed at green shift, albeit to a great extent in the more diverse economy of Stord than at Verdal. The green momentum is somewhat lost in the third critical juncture with the prioritization of short-term reactive policy. It's argued that social issues, the question of justice, will provide time for a green shift, but the international market pull could play a major role in accelerating the process. We still recognize contradictions here and dilemmas in these matters. Finally, we offer some preliminary policy advices on policy mix and procedures regarding policy mix and substance. Technology push policy has to be combined with market creation policies and green regulation. Destabilization of the incumbent regime is necessary, but this is also a question of time for collaborative procedures and preparations. For example, encourage resource redeployment, including reskilling, retraining, etc. And particularly to accelerate and scale up of the domestic offshore wind market development. Regarding procedures on participation, just transition could build on Norwegian tradition of tripartite cooperation, creating frames for legitimate and predictable sustainable transition. It's also important to ensure that the short-term reactive policies do not become barriers for transition or entrench incumbents. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Asbjørn, for this really interesting presentation, addressing very current issues related to the COVID crisis and the reaction on that. I would now first invite Espen Moe to give his comments to the presentation. Before then, we all can ask questions and give some comments.
Yeah, how much time do I have?
Up to you, but at least 5-10 minutes if you want.
Oh, no, completely up to me. As Asbjørn knows, this will be a slightly jumbled take on his slides, and it will take the form of questions more than criticism, and undoubtedly, if this were a paper, many of my questions would already be answered. But I'll sort of just take it more or less slide by slide, or go through it more or less chronologically. Yeah. The first one. So I mean, I'm a political scientist with a specialization in political economy. So my first question is: so is there sort of any underlying model of structural change, any underlying model of long-term change in the political economy? I mean, you use a lot of terms that I'm fairly familiar and fairly happy about. But I'm sort of curious about how to what extent is this a model about the present shift, the present energy shift, and to what extent do you draw on lessons about structural change going back like 250 years, and then in previous energy shifts and stuff like that. You're right that we need to accelerate the sustainable transition, which is definitely very true, a very valid point. But does that mean that you want to throw away all the stuff that we know about structural change from the past because that's not valid, or does it mean that you're still basically relying on models of structural change from the past and just adding this we need to accelerate the transition part? Policy mix. I was a little unclear about what the core of the policy mix concept was. I completely agree about the destabilizing of the old incumbent regimes and the creation of new regimes, but I also wondered, does this mean that old regimes cannot change? When you talk about regimes, are you talking about political actors only, or political actors and industrial actors and whatever other actors? Because Equinor's big new thing, whether it's fact or fiction, is to become an energy company. And if that's genuine and successful, then we have a case of old regime actors, the old incumbent regime transforming itself instead of being replaced by a new regime. Another comment I have is, so there's this book by Anthony Patt that came out in 2015 that introduces the concept of clumsy solutions. So not solutions that are perfect to any one single actor, but solutions that are reasonably useful for a number of actors put together. The point being that most actors don't have climate as number one, and if you can sell in climate as sort of a byproduct in whatever, something that's good for health, or something that's good for the economy, or something that is good for whatever, then the potential for structural change is much greater.
The name was Anthony
Patt, P-A-T-T.
Patt, yeah, and clumsy
solutions.
Solutions, yes. Yeah.
But his book is called Transforming Turnaround, because it's called Transforming Energy. On just transitions. So is just transition more important than just transition? Is it a different goal? Must any transition be a just transition, or is there even a trade-off between transitions and just transitions? So is just more than just a buzzword to get funding? What I definitely do agree with is, and this was in the slides that you sent me and not the slides that you presented here, under differentiated responsibility, the importance of giving the losers a way out. And for this, active state intervention is probably absolutely necessary. But I could also, if I wanted to be difficult, and I mean, that's what we've been trained to do, trained to be. I could argue that there could even be a trade-off between transitions and just transitions, and that an unjust transition will be a more effective transition than a just transition, because if you're going to, if by just transition you mean raising people's living standards and bringing everyone up to Western living standards and stuff like that, that would be a disaster to the climate. So an unjust transition is way better for the climate than a just transition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you get the argument. So basically my question is, how important is just to your project? It also says something about social ecological change in the balance of power. I don't remember if this was on my slides or on the slides that you showed here. And I was wondering if that was a goal or if it was a precondition. The same thing about public ownership. Is it a goal? Is it a precondition? Is it a part of a model of structural, political, economic change? You mentioned dialogue. That's definitely important, because avoiding alternative realities and avoiding identity politics is important to make a project like this work. But based on the slides, it was a little hard to know exactly how how these things fit in if it is a part of a model of change, or if they are preconditions, or if they are just lofty goals and whatnot. On the research questions, the geography of just sustainable transitions and legitimation of appropriate multi-scalar policy mixes and novel insights. Could you give me an intuition on what these novel insights is? And that's not me being difficult, that's me being curious, because I mean, you're a geographer and I'm a political scientist, and we work on many of the same things, but we use different words. So what is it that you can do with your field that I can't do with mine? First research question seems mainly descriptive, seems mainly like a mapping exercise. Several research questions, I'm not completely sure if that is a continuation on the first one, if it builds on the first one, or if it's a separate mapping exercise, or if there's a puzzle to be answered. Then going on to the case studies, I like critical junctures. I've always thought that disequilibria are at least as important as equilibria, and that you should never waste a crisis. Crises are moments that enable you to shift the political consensus, to root out old vested interests, etc., etc. So I was a little curious about these critical junctures. Are they government shifts, economic shifts, energy shifts? So exactly what made them critical junctures? Were they easily defined with COVID 2020? Sure, I can see that one. That one is kind of obvious. Are the two others equally obvious? And do the three junctures, what do they show us? Do they show us so are they more than just a format for mapping the past? Can they say something about how to create successful future transitions? Can they say something empirically about what worked and what didn't work? Success factors in Norwegian transitions. So I'm a little curious about what the intention, what the ambition is. And do they prove anything beyond the fact that structural change is difficult? Do they go beyond proving the strength of vested interests, and that it's easier to accomplish change when you don't have to combat existing structures? And what happened to just? Because I'm not really sure what these seem more like transition processes than just transition processes, which is fine by me. But if just is an important part of this, then that sort of disappeared, I think, in this very short, brief elaboration of exposition of the case studies. And that also brings me to a couple of questions about sort of what is the purpose of the project? Is it describing, explaining the past, or is it saying something general about transitions? Is it more about the past, or is it also about predicting the future? Does the ambition go beyond Norway? Because obviously it's coined as industrially over-specialized regions, which is one which I read as Norway. And obviously the two case studies are from Norway, but it could obviously easily be other countries as well. And finally, what is the link between the policy advice and the case studies? Give me a second here. I have a sick child at home, so I'm in continuous correspondence with my wife. Point was link between the policy advice and the case studies. So destabilization of incumbent regimes is necessary. I completely agree. But what do the two cases actually tell us about that? Do we see any destabilization of incumbent regimes in any of the three junctures? To what extent are the two cases part of and not part of the incumbent regimes, because there are obviously major Norwegian industrial actors. Did they work actively to shape the future by changing politics, by lobbying? Are they established even incumbent actors working actively to change the landscape? And the same thing with procedure and participation. What is a link with the case studies? And I also read that you talked about Norwegian as a coordinated market economy. Does that mean there's a varieties of capitalism component here? Because I'm the project leader for a research council application that has varieties of capitalism at its core. So if that's the case, we probably should talk beyond this beyond this Zoom call. That was going extremely fast through a number of jumbled points. Yeah.
Thank you, Espen.
I could elaborate more on them, but I think it's more important to just get it out and yeah.
Thank you.
And in general, obviously, a really interesting project. And whether it's dependent on funding or not, I hope that this will happen.
Okay, Asbjørn, that were very many questions. So I don't know if you would like to pick a few which you would like to reply to, which you consider interesting for the audience.
Yeah, I'll try as best. Thank you very much. It was an extensive list of questions and quite challenging questions as well. So I'm not sure if I'm able to respond adequately on all of them, but I will do my best. And perhaps also my co-author Samson also could contribute if he will. So yeah, it's something about the character of this this manuscript that it's covered a long period of time, and it's also discussing quite recent challenges and questions. So what do we need this history for? And the first question you said is it some underlining long time change that is happening in the political economy that we should reveal here? We are not very explicit on that. I agree on that. I believe there have been some globalization tendencies and neoliberal shifts in politics over time that is probably also reflected in policies. For example, the shift from a policy of when it comes to more spatial policies, such as from regional restructuring programs to cluster programs, focusing more on innovation and competitions, and perhaps less on jobs, job creation. So we should perhaps reflect more on that. And then you had a question on policy mix. What I don't see actually what I have written here, but is it just about policy actors, or could it also cover other actors? And that is a quite relevant questions, as you know, that they are changing in incumbent companies having strategies in renewable sectors, partly independent on at least national policies. So I see that you mentioned Aker BP and also Equinor. We see this And that's a relevant question. Is that if this should be included in the policy mix?
I could elaborate very shortly. So I mean, I'm a proud Schumpeterian, and I've been so for 25 years. And I think Schumpeter would have said that for a real structural change, the old incumbent regime has to die. But we also know that the old incumbent regime is one of the strongest incumbent regimes that we've ever seen. So the more pragmatic solution would be for the incumbent regime to change. Then we would have less of a structural change, but maybe a more a less vulnerable one, and one that could produce climate solutions instead of, yeah. So.
Yep. Good. Okay, and then you had this point on Anthony Pat on clumsy solutions. If climate could be some sort of a byproduct of other changes and restructuring processes, and yeah, I believe, and you have this element of greening as a way of branding and marketing the companies. So I could see that.
May I ask, Björn?
Yeah.
This is Samson.
Samson, yes, please.
Yeah, it's a way, in a way, a response to Espen. I mean, we are. What I want to make clear is that we are sort of criticizing the creative destruction perspective, because, and here comes the geography part, or the novel contribution that we're talking about, because the context, in a way, hinders whether you're going to successfully accelerate sustainability transitions, especially in over-specialized regions, such as in Norway. I mean, creative destruction can be difficult because you're not only dealing with the incumbent actors, such as the big oil and gas companies, but also other stakeholders, such as the civic society, labor unions, and other. You have to deal with a whole host of actors in order to be successful in achieving sustainability transition or accelerating such sustainability transition. And thus, we are arguing for there is a need for we have to take into consideration the question of justice and equity.
Yeah.
Thank you, Samson. Yeah, considering the time, I would like to encourage some more reflections, maybe exactly about the issue of the just. Yeah. How do you conceptualize the just transition in this context, and then open for questions from the audience, maybe.
Yes, that's a normative standpoint, and it's embedded in this just transition literature, sustainable transition literature. And when you ask about, is it a trade-off between just transition and other kinds of transitions? Yes, I believe so. But I think at the same time, our point is that a sustainable transition is more is probably more successful if we have this collaborative approach, which is a tradition in Norway. It's some sort of a pragmatic standpoint in this debate. What is feasible in the context of the Norwegian social democracy, I think. So this is why we are covering the history, is to show the heritage of this tripartite collaboration, which could be a resource to rely on in this just sustainable transitions. Yeah. Yeah, I could start. We could later talk about varieties of capitalism and this as an example of a coordinated market economy. Espen, I think.
Okay, thank you for some answers on some very complex questions here. I would like to open for questions and comments from the audience. You can both just raise your hand or talk or write it in the chat. Yes, Alexander? Would you like? There, yeah.
Hi, Espen.
Hey.
Yeah.
Alexander.
So just one thing. I noticed in your entire presentation, you never once mentioned the word labor. And for me, it's a bit, or maybe you did it and I missed it, but generally, for me, it's a bit strange to be talking about just transitions and not to be talking about labor, because just transition is generally a concept that has been utilized by activist organizations focusing on the labor aspect. And I think connected to that is that question, well, when we try to make this differentiation between sustainable transitions and just transitions, and Espen pointed out, a oil company can, for example, like Equinor can, for example, say, we're going to go into offshore wind, but and maybe start investing in that in a time of crisis, but at the same time could be laying off quite a number of its workers. Contractors can be in quite precarious position. It's not necessarily that oil companies will use contractors in their transition in their transitions. So in other words, there's all these workers floating around. And the the question is, what to do with them. And I think connected to this, and not something I'm suggesting that you have to put in this paper, but something to think about further, is who exactly is better positioned to transition, the companies or the workers themselves? Because you could have policies that are enabling workers transition. For example, allowing workers to collect welfare while they're getting education, for example. Different labor-oriented policies, and I think that comes down to a question: which knowledge is more important? Is in terms of this transition? Is it the knowledge of the workers themselves, or is it the knowledge that's embedded within the companies and the routines that the companies have? I mean, you and I both know that both knowledges are important, but there's also a question on who is more path dependent. And there's also a question, Equinor, for example, they want to be an energy company, but it's not necessarily energy companies that Norway needs in order to give jobs for employees laid off by oil companies. There could be many different industries which these employees can go to. So there might be a problem that Equinor and other oil companies are focusing on certain industries which don't really provide job opportunities for the workers who actually need it. So the question is who actually should be leading the transition? And when you talk about the policy mixes, it seems most of this is occurring on the organization level and not so much on the labor level.
Thank you for constructive comment, Alexander. I'm sorry if I didn't mention labor explicitly, but it's here, of course. I'm talking about jobs and workers and unions, so it's implicit. But it's interesting questions about if the large energy or oil companies are using these critical junctures to quit labor, and who is in the better position to help out the sustainable transition, the labor by themselves or as embedded in larger companies. And I agree that there should be labor should be helped out to have some autonomy and to have a better position, for example, by attending, by offering training, reskilling, etc., So they could, so their position via their employer are strengthened, and they could have further alternatives. I agree on that. Was it a reasonable answer?
Certainly.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We have another question from Marius.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to say that I thought it was a very good presentation. I learned a lot, and I liked the very systematic approach of comparing those two cases and simultaneously addressing those three topics that you are addressing, and also embedding the just aspect. I think is very important. It seems to be kind of an put equality sign between just and social focus based on the presentation, and I think that's fine as well. But justice, I think, is also more than just the social. I mean, there are specific topics that have been addressed in the just transition literature connected to inequality and access and so on. But my question was actually just a very simple one, and I might have missed it during the presentation, so apologies if I missed it. But I was just wondering, because it's also in the title, is the word over-specialized region. And I was wondering what that is, because I mean, if it's specialized, I understand that it's specialized, but it's over-specialized. It means that it's so specialized that it's not so good anymore, I guess, or apparently they have a history in these regions of specializing in something, and now it's gone too far, or is that, I don't know. Yeah, it's a very simple question, I guess. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marius, for the comment. Yeah, I agree that just is more pointing at the social aspect here, and not so much on other kinds of just transitions. What is over-specialized regions? Yeah, we have this tradition of one company town and single industry towns in Norway, but also elsewhere in the world, pointing perhaps at this dependence and vulnerability. So it's a reflection on this their situation in an international global economy where they are vulnerable, I think. So over-specialized is also pointing at some policy instruments in Norway, as this regional restructuring program that is running and targeting these kinds of regions that are easily hit by business cycles or loss of markets and so on. Yeah, so it's a problem regions.
Thank you. Then I think we take a last question from Thomas.
Yeah, thanks. Really interesting presentation, and lots of good comments also. So I want to ask a question about the relationship. So policy mixes. I mean, it's in a sense a pretty alluring concept, because it sort of hints at the notion of sort of producing some instruments that can be used to make change, almost in a non-political sense. So there's this feeling that you have these instruments lying around, decontextualized, and you can kind of grab them and implement them. So I was kind of thinking about the relationship between politics and policy, and especially policy mixes. And from your presentation, it struck me that in your discussion about the 2020 critical juncture, it's almost as if the oil incumbents are the one that now recognizes that this is a political matter in which certain choices need to be made, whereas the political actors sort of seems to just stimulate status quo through certain policy instruments, as if this was not a moment, for decisive political action. So I was just interested in this relationship between policies and politics in general. I guess it's a pretty big question, but maybe you have a short comment.
Yeah, the difference between policy and politics, and yeah, it's, as I say, I think, as I understood, policy mix, it's more instrumental. It's a script, or where you have some components or instruments, measures, whereas politics, you also talk about power and power relations and implementation of policy. So yeah, the procedures, then you, when you're talking about politics, you're talking about the procedures where you have consultations and participation and changes in power balances, I think. So that's our interpretation of this. With regard to the 2020 incident, is it the big oil incumbents that take a lead, and whereas the political actors are just hanging to the incumbent regime? They take some initiatives, as we see, we recognize that, but it's very complex and paradoxical, I think. So we can't say it's just that way. I think it's complex, and they are pointing at a process that takes time, and there are different positions in this process, I think. I'm not sure if you, Samson, would add something on this.
Well, not much apart from saying that, I mean, transition is a political process, I mean, and we shouldn't forget that this oil and gas companies, for example, Equinor is a state-owned company. I mean, it's the state that you have to, that you're dealing with here, and there is a lot of politics going on.
Yeah, and they are committed in some ways. They are not pure market. They are not pure market actors. They are committed in some way.
But now it seems that there is also this international market pool. I mean, there is a lot going on internationally or globally in the renewable energy sector that is inducing these firms, in order to make some serious commitments towards this sector.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you all. A lot of questions to be continuously discussed, I think. Then I would like all of you to thank all of you for joining us for the presentation, and Espen for his comments.
I would also like to thank the organizer and Espen as preparing questions and comments, very constructive, and also the rest of the audience helping out to prepare this paper, and hopefully to have a succeed to publish it later on.
Thank you. And then I just would like to say that in 2 weeks we have a webinar on how climate change makes us feel and what it means for our mental health and climate action taking from the Department of Psychology. So I hope to see you all again on the 24th of November. Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.